A few years ago, an influential social psychologist at Stanford died. His name was Lee Ross, and his view was that all of us are intuitive psychologists. We spend our lives making attributions and creating informal theories to explain why people do what they do. His key insight, though maybe he didn't have the catchiest label for it, was something he called the Fundamental Attribution Error, which he described as the tendency to underestimate the impact of situational factors and to overestimate the role of dispositional factors in controlling behavior. This is the foundation of all of social psychology and all of the research that supports it. The idea is that how we act and who we are reflect the circumstances in which we find ourselves, but most of us overlook the effects of the social environment we're in and pay too much attention to things like character and personality and individual responsibility. There are 4 very well-known social psychology experiments. Actually, 3 of them are very famous. And 2 of them, one of which involves people literally shocking other people, the other involves marshmallows, are widely misunderstood. So today, I want to offer a quick and perhaps somewhat surprising reappraisal of social psychology studies and some thoughts about how the idea of the fundamental attribution error can turn our understanding of education upside down. I'm Alfie Kohn, and this is Kohn's Zone. Okay, so here come the most important experiments, some of which, as I say, are commonly misinterpreted in chronological order. The first one, which is the least well-known, is called the Robber's Cave experiment. It was done by a guy named Muzaffar Sharif and his colleagues in the early 1950s in a section of Oklahoma. That's what Robber's Cave was named for, this section. It was done at a Boy Scout camp with 11 and 12-year-old boys who were quite ordinary, and they were split into teams for the whole 3-week camp session. They were either a rattler or an eagle, and they lived in separate cabins depending on which team they were on, and they competed in everything, all the sports, based on those team assignments, with prizes given for the winner each time. The result of steeping them in an environment of competition is an outbreak, an epidemic of taunting and insulting, where they burned each other's banners and they attacked each other after the games and at night. Even the kids who came in knowing each other with their best friends would turn against their friends. There was no difference in the kind of kids who were in each team, and there was no reason to believe that any of the kids were particularly aggressive. The ugliness, the aggressive behavior was created solely by the situation, which in this case was competition. Now, the experimenters became a little concerned about this and tried to figure out how to undo all this damage. And their first thought, which is not surprising in America, is to have more competition of a different kind, namely to have the kids cooperate so they can beat the kids in a different camp. Intergroup competition. But they found that as soon as the common enemy was gone, the hostility returned. Plus, as Sharif commented, we would have just had a bigger war on our hands. In other words, they'd just be enlarging the scope of the aggression. So instead, they came up with another plan, which was superordinate goals, which is tasks that required all the kids to cooperate together. I think one of them was they faked a kind of breakdown of the water system in the camp. But the point is, all the kids had to work together, forgetting what team they had been assigned to earlier, but not in such a way that they were competing against anyone else. Now, the message here, which I could talk about and probably will talk about in a slightly other context, is that competition creates an ugliness that can't be solved with a different layer of competition. Ideally, you want cooperation within groups and among groups, if you have to have groups at all. But the big picture, the more important message here of this experiment was, you put ordinary kids in an us against them situation, and you end up with truly distressing behavior because the environment they're in, that is, the system of competition, swamps or eclipses the characteristics of the individuals. So now we go forward 10 years, early 1960s, and we go to the East Coast, the basement of a building at Yale University for the famous Stanley Milgram experiments. You're probably familiar with this. They convinced ordinary volunteers to deliver what they thought were painful electric shocks to complete strangers when told by the experimenter wearing an official-looking white lab coat that this was an important part of a teaching exercise. But here's what you may not know or remember from these experiments. The main objective that Milgram had was not to prove how readily people will obey authority, even if it involves doing things that seem appalling. What Milgram was interested in is how obedience changes in response to modifications in the environment. As he put it, quote, "Often it is not so much the kind of person a man is as the kind of situation in which he finds himself that determines how he will act," unquote. So specifically, will people still cause what they think is great pain to somebody if they can hear that person crying out? What about if they are in the same room with the person? What about if they have to force that person's hand right onto the electrical device? More subjects refused to carry out the instructions with each of these iterations of the experiment. The less remote your victim is, the less willing people are to make somebody suffer, even if they have to defy authority and say no. So the first takeaway from the Milgram experiment is that it is harder to dehumanize somebody who is palpably, undeniably human. This reminds me of a comment that a psychologist named Nicholas Humphrey once made. He proposed that arms control negotiators should be required to talk to each other in the nude. Something about that humanness. In other words, the Milgram experiments were actually much more optimistic about human nature than the usual moral drawn from them. But the second takeaway from the Milgram studies is it's not about human nature at all. It's about the environment and how that affects human nature. Let's go forward another 10 years, early 1970s. This time we're in the basement of a building on the West Coast at Stanford University, Lee Ross's alma mater. So you know this experiment too, right? The prison experiment. 24 college students who were chosen specifically for how normal they were based on their scores on a psychological test were randomly assigned to be either guards or inmates in a make-believe prison that was set up in the basement. And they started to become their roles to frightening effect, with the guards becoming increasingly cruel and sadistic, and the inmates developing a kind of learned helplessness right away. It was very distressing, to the point that Phil Zimbardo, who created this experiment, was persuaded by one of the graduate students helping him to stop the experiment early after 6 days. Now, there are ethical concerns about the way this experiment was done. This one, and probably Milgram's, would never get past an IRB. The human subject research can't be done in this way anymore. But Zimbardo's experiment, like Milgram's and like Sharif's, emphasized how it's not mostly about the personalities of the individuals, but the circumstances in which they're placed. Also in the early 70s, the fourth experiment I want to talk about, which you may have heard about as well, and also at Stanford, well, actually about a mile from Stanford at the Stanford-affiliated Bing Nursery School, was the marshmallow experiments. Here's the way it's usually described. Kids were offered a marshmallow or, in some iterations, a pretzel, and they were told they could eat it now, or they could wait and not eat it, in which case they would get 2 marshmallows or pretzels, but they didn't know when. And it's usually described that the kids who could wait for the extra treat years later scored better on various measures of cognitive and social skills and got higher SAT scores and so on. So we should teach kids to put off the payoff as long as possible, and they'll be more successful in life. But that is not what that experiment was really about. The main question that the guy doing the experiment, Walter Mischel, was interested in wasn't whether kids could wait, which, by the way, most of them could. It wasn't even whether the waiters fared better in life. What he was interested in was how kids go about trying to wait, which strategies were helpful. Turned out that kids waited a lot longer when they were distracted, like by a toy. What worked best wasn't, as Mischel put it, quote, self-denial and grim determination. It was doing something enjoyable while they waited so that self-control wasn't needed at all. I'm going to quote him again. What we should be talking about is not the ability to defer immediate gratification. This ability has been viewed as an enduring trait of ego strength, on which individuals differed stably and consistently in many situations. In fact, as the present data indicate, under appropriate conditions, virtually all subjects, even young children, could manage to delay for lengthy time periods. Unquote. So Mischel varied different details of the situation, and he found that there was a much bigger effect of the details of the situation in predicting the outcome than any trait that the individuals had. This is completely different from the usual message that self-control is a matter of, individual characteristics, and we ought to help children develop that. By the way, some newer experiments trying to replicate the marshmallow experiments just in the last few years have found that whether they wait or not doesn't predict the outcomes in adulthood at all. They were unable to replicate that part of the experiment. Another experiment done a few years ago found that whether kids did hold out for the second marshmallow depended on their prior experience with whether that would be a rational thing to do, and they would end up getting what they were promised. Those who learned that they might not get what they were promised took the marshmallow, and good for them. It's appropriate. I've written more about these experiments in my book, The Myth of the Spoiled Child, and in an article. I'll have links to that in the notes to this episode. Walter Mischel, by the way, made his reputation in the field of psychology before the marshmallow experiments by specifically arguing that the whole idea that each of us has an integrated, consistent personality across situations is basically false, that who we are depends largely on the situations in which we find themselves. So the marshmallow experiments were completely in keeping with his whole theoretical construct and completely inconsistent with the individualistic moral that people draw from it. Oh, there are a lot more social psych experiments that I'm not going to go into here. For example, finding that how helpful, how generous people are is to a large extent a function of the environment we're in. For example, whether we live in a small town or a big city. Studies showing that bad driving is less a function of personality than it is of the roads and the signage. I speak here from experience as somebody who lives in Boston. The social norms you live in determine the way you act and so on. None of this means that personal responsibility doesn't matter or that attitudes and temperaments don't play a role. Of course they do. But if you minimize the environment, you can't really understand what's going on. And also, you're less likely, if you minimize the environment, to question the environment, the structures that exist. There's no reason to challenge, let alone change, the way things are set up if you assume that all that matters is personal characteristics, like people needing to buckle down and try harder. All of this connects with the long American tradition of the self-help movement, and more recently, an emphasis on self-care. In another episode, I talked specifically about inspirational posters and slogans in schools, an episode called Bad Signs, that taps into this same conceptual apparatus having to do with the political implications of focusing almost exclusively on the individual. So the idea of the fundamental attribution error, overemphasizing the role of the individual, is, not surprisingly, more prevalent in a society like ours, where individualism is a good description of the reality of our society and also a cherished ideal. Americans are famous for stubbornly denying the possibility that what we do is shaped profoundly by policies and norms and systems and other structural realities. There's a long tendency in this country to believe that people who commit crimes are morally deficient, that the have-nots are just lazy or at least insufficiently resourceful, that people who are overweight just lack willpower. Each example of somebody who commits a crime or eats too much or is struggling to make ends meet, we act as if it had never happened before, as if that individual was acting out of sheer perversity or incompetence or something. Matthew Desmond, a writer about poverty and homelessness in this society, recently noted that if we see somebody who's homeless, the typical reaction in many countries is to wonder how the state failed this person. But in America, we're more likely to wonder what poor decisions that individual made. So the tendency to think in these terms and to make this error is a function of structures that are often created by corporations. For example, it's sort of like an example of how we individualize social problems and who benefits from that. 3 quick examples. A lot of people are drowning in debt, and we tend to think of them as, again, not having the self-control they need to avoid getting into debt. But the credit industry spends millions of dollars to get people hooked on borrowing money early in life, even as teenagers. A second example dates back to the 1950s with the Keep America Beautiful program, which was where we get the phrase, "Don't be a litter bug," which older listeners may remember. That whole ad campaign was financed by the American Can Company and other corporations. And the effect is to stop people from questioning who profits from the production of disposable merchandise and its packaging. One more example, the concept more recently of a personal carbon footprint was popularized by the oil company BP in a $100 million media campaign intended to deflect responsibility for the climate emergency away from fossil fuel companies and onto the individual consumer who needs to be having different light bulbs or taking shorter showers or something. Anyway, the larger issue here of the fundamental attribution error plays out in education in a big way. The FAE, Fundamental Attribution Error, takes the form of FTK, fix the kid. So when students tune out or act out in class, the assumption is they're the ones with the problem. They're the ones who have to change. Now, teachers react to that in different ways. The hard-ass teachers will punish the kid for not paying attention or for acting out. The groovier teachers will try to help the child improve their behavior. But the old school and new school teachers share the fundamental attribution error, assuming the problem is almost always a defect in the makeup of the kid's attitude or motivation or character needs to be corrected, as opposed to looking at the structural factors. To what extent is the task the kid was asked to do not particularly engaging or relevant? Or the fact that the kid may have had no role in deciding that, no choice about what he or she is doing. To say nothing of the larger economic and social context in which education takes place. Irrelevant, A British social scientist named Val Gillies pointed out that policymakers' attentions have shifted away from structures and processes and towards a focus on personal skills and self-efficacy. Even more or less benign strategies to enhance social and emotional learning are sometimes motivated less by a desire to foster kids' well-being than by a hope that teaching them to regulate their feelings rather than express them will make it easier for adults to manage them and keep them on task. I don't know if you've sat through parent-teacher conferences, but if you sit through a bunch of them, it may dawn on you that almost the entirety of those conversations, what the teacher's pointing out to the parents, is about only the individual kid. How hard that kid is trying or not trying, how the kid's behavior is improving or getting worse, that the kid is not motivated enough or motivation is improving. As if you never have to ask about the curriculum or the style of teaching. It's all down to the kid. Every parent-teacher conference is an illustration of the fundamental attribution error. And many times when teachers get together, they or get all wistful and nostalgic about, wishing they had better students the way we used to in the good old days. Again, it's all about who the kids are. A few decades ago, I wrote a long piece about character education, which was very big then, about instilling virtues in individual kids. Around the same time, we talked a lot about teaching kids skills, how kids could become more helpful or more assertive or develop critical thinking skills. None of it had to do with whether they were inclined to do these things, a disposition to be helpful or stand up for themselves or question what they're told, let alone the extent to which various structures they were in might encourage or discourage kids to do this. I have great concerns about which virtues tended to be embodied in character education. But even if we disagree about whether, say, loyalty is more important than generosity, the point is it was all framed in individualistic terms. And that's true more recently in education of the non-academic approaches we want to emphasize, like self-discipline, self-regulation, deferral of gratification, a growth mindset, persistence, and grit. These are all especially popular with conservative psychologists. The conservatism of a guy like Martin Seligman and his student, Angela Duckworth, the Gritmeister, it's not a coincidence. They argue explicitly that underachievement is not explained by structural factors, social, economic, even educational, but rather can be attributed to the kids themselves and their failure to exercise self-discipline. Another example of this, which I will deal with by itself in a separate episode, is academic cheating. The way we normally think about academic cheating, most recently with the use of AI like ChatGPT, when they're not supposed to be using that stuff, but plagiarism, whatever it is we're supposed to be more observant to be able to catch kids cheating using various techniques, some of them involving online resources, and nab them and punish them and so on, and make it clear we won't stand for academic cheating. Yet for 100 years, we've had research that shows that slight differences in the classroom or the school, in the academic environment, has a huge effect on kids' willingness to cheat. You show me a classroom or school that's all about rigor and performance and achievement and so on, especially one where it feels competitive and it's all about grades, I'll show you a place where lots of kids will break the rules and be accused of cheating, regardless of their personalities. By contrast, the kinds of classrooms and schools that are not pressure cookers, where it's really about engaging with ideas and playing with words and numbers and ideas, very, very few kids cheat. Back in 1928, a classic social science study concluded that cheating is as much a function of the particular situation in which the student is placed as it is of his general ideas and ideals. But you have to look long and hard to find discussions of cheating that don't commit the fundamental attribution error by focusing on the morals of the kids. And it's not just about cheating, it's about their attitudes, their motivational orientation. It's very popular to blame kids for being grade grubbers, for turning to the kid next to them. What'd you get? What'd you get? That whole syndrome, or attributing it to their learning style or something. But academic dispositions, such as the extent to which they're interested and focused on grades, are shaped by the environment. Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester and his colleagues wrote, "Given particular outer conditions and approaches to education, an inner world will eventually emerge which conforms to it and matches it," unquote. And in fact, there's a load of research that finds that controlling classrooms where the teacher makes all the decisions unilaterally and possibly rewards kids for good performance or good behavior leads to kids who are more extrinsically oriented, more dependent on grades and other rewards. Whereas a classroom that is autonomy supportive, that does not involve artificial inducements, does not have grades and rewards, and where kids make a lot of the decisions, tends to lead to kids becoming more intrinsic in their personal orientation. The horrible irony is that when kids have been marinated in rewards like grades, and they end up asking, "What'd you get?" all the time, we then tend to turn around and blame them, saying, "Well, of course, I've got to give grades. If there wasn't a grade for it, they'd never do the assignment." As if the problem was with the kid, not with the system the kid was caught up in. One of my favorite experiments done by a researcher named Ruth Butler had a whole bunch of kids do some artistic, creative task, but half of them were assigned to a condition where they were just told to play with the possibility, see how imaginative they could become, really get immersed in the drawing. And the other half were told that this was an experiment to see how creative they were. And then after they did the drawing, the kids were led into another room where there were two tables. And one of the tables contained examples of how other kids had responded to the same prompt, the drawings that they had made. And the other table had a way they could calculate their creativity score to see how well they had done. You can see this coming, right? The kids who went over to see what their score was were the kids who had been told from the beginning that this was about their creativity level, their performance. The kids who were just asked to be creative, who were just framed that way, were more interested in seeing how other kids had drawn what they had drawn, and were not focused on the outcome, their performance, and so on. It's not about the kids being grade grubbers. It's about the system in which they had found themselves, even in a one-shot experiment. Okay, I want one last example for you. 2 studies, small, suggestive, not definitive studies, way back in the 1970s of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. One was done in suburban Washington, D.C., the other in upstate New York. Elementary school kids who had been all diagnosed as hyperactive. In both studies were randomly assigned to either a traditional classroom with, worksheets and lectures and so on, or a non-traditional classroom. In one of the study, that meant, quote, individualized instruction, relatively free movement in the classroom, and teacher-child cooperation in planning the child's school experience. In the other study, it was mostly just that the kid had some say about what the task was. One of the studies used independent outside observers to watch kids over a period of time in their classroom, and the other relied on the ratings from their own teachers. In the traditional classrooms, they found exactly what you would expect. The kids who had been diagnosed as having ADHD acted the way you would expect, hyperactive and had trouble focusing. But in the non-traditional classrooms, there were no meaningful differences between the groups. In fact, in the study with the outside observers, they couldn't even tell which kids supposedly had this thing called ADHD, hyperactivity. The fundamental attribution disorder is baked into the attributions we make that sometimes get congealed as labels and diagnoses. We're all on a continuum regarding how active we are or our capacity to focus. It's not either you have this problem or you don't, just like we're all on a continuum in terms of how stable or variable our moods are, or how good our sense of direction is, or how easy or difficult it is for us to write or draw or sing or whatever. But where we are on just about any continuum is not a fixed fact about us. How easily we're distracted, for example, depends on what we're doing and why we're doing it and with whom and in what sort of classroom or what sort of workplace and in what kind of culture. To locate everything inside our heads, to assume that how we act is just a function of us as discrete individuals, as if we existed in a vacuum devoid of any context, is an error. When it comes to explaining human behavior, it may even be the fundamental error.